A West Derby haunting. Ghosts that cause harm are thankfully very rare, but I remember one case a few years ago in which a man died from a heart attack after being chased through his Anfield home by the ghost of a girl. I have myself been harmed by a poltergeist. A nail was driven through my left hand, and then there was the case many years ago in which a poltergeist left a priest needing 8 stitches to his head when a large television set was thrown at him. The following story is about another of these violent manifestations. In March 2008, Greg, a 28-year-old security guard, moved to a flat in West Derby, close to Mab Lane. Greg was originally from Bootle, but had moved after separating from his partner, Ashley. As a result of the traumatic time he had gone through with Ashley, he vowed never to live with anyone again for the foreseeable future. Nevertheless, by the middle of March, with the promise of spring in the air, the security guard could not help noticing a beautiful girl who worked in a certain shop on Church Street in the city center. He plucked up the courage to ask her out for a drink, and to his surprise, she accepted at once. The girl's name was Emma. By April, 26-year-old Emma was already talking about settling down with someone, and this made Greg a little wary of how seriously he was getting involved with her so soon after his split with Ashley. One half of his mind was saying, "Come on, Greg, you're approaching 30, and she's the one," whilst the other half was warning him to keep Emma at arm's length, at least for now. After all, had Ashley not seemed equally wonderful at the beginning of their relationship? Early one evening in his new West Derby flat, Greg fell asleep on the sofa. He often enjoyed a nap before starting his night shift. He dreamed that Ashley was kissing his face and stroking his shoulder, but when he woke up at around 10 p.m., the lounge was in darkness, and he could still feel someone's lips pressing on his mouth. A moment later, the kissing sensation suddenly went away. Greg groped for the lamp and switched it on and swore when he saw the time. Why hadn't the alarm clock gone off? He had set it for 8:30 p.m., as he had to be in work for 10 p.m. sharp. He saw that the button had been pressed down to cancel the alarm, but he knew that he hadn't done it. He had definitely set it before his nap, and he had not touched it since. He drove like a madman to his workplace in the city center, and only at 1:30 a.m., during a break in his rounds, did he have time to dwell on that strange kiss he had felt after waking up from the dream of Ashley. He asked his workmate, an older man named Clark, if he had ever had sensations from a dream which overlapped into his waking life. Clark grinned and said, "Oh yeah, I've dreamt I was making love to a woman and woken to find myself kissing the pillow. Woke up drooling another time after I bit my tongue. I'd been dreaming I was eating a meatball marinara sandwich in Subway." "No, listen, this really was happening to me. I was still being kissed after I'd woken up." "What are you complaining about, mate? That's not so bad, is it?" laughed Clark, and then turned his attention back to the CCTV monitor as he drank from a can of Red Bull. The next day at 4 p.m., Greg was in the shower when he thought he heard his landline telephone ringing in the lounge. He slipped out of the shower and poked his head out of the bathroom doorway, listening. "Must be next door's phone," he said to himself as he could no longer hear the telephone ringing. Suddenly feeling chilled, he hurried back into the shower and started singing under the hot, invigorating jet of water. Emma, meanwhile, was at her home on Queens Drive, Walton, feeling a little shocked. With her mobile phone pressed to her ear, she listened to an unknown female voice who had answered Greg's phone. "He's in the shower," was all this woman had to say. "Oh, right. Could you tell him Emma called then?" she said, feeling a cold lump of foreboding swelling in her throat. The woman hung up without a word of reply. When Emma told her mother what had just happened, she told her not to jump to conclusions. There was probably a perfectly innocent explanation for what had happened. "Has he got a sister, for example?" she asked. Emma shook her head, too choked up to say a word because Greg had told her he was an only child. "Are you sure you dialed the right number?" Emma's mom asked. "It's easily done to get just one digit wrong. I've done it myself many a time." "Look, Mum, it was definitely the right number." "Oh, Emma, love, you're probably worrying yourself over nothing. He's not the two-timing type. I can spot those types a mile off. I know I've only met him once, but he seemed really genuine to me." Emma's mother put the kettle on and smiled reassuringly at her daughter, but Emma could see it was forced, It was obvious that she now had doubts about Greg as well. Emma decided not to try phoning him again, scared that it might confirm her worst fears. So she waited until he called her at 6:30 p.m., and she was very cool towards him, something he picked up on immediately from the flat tone of her voice. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emma decided to confront him head-on. "Who was that woman who answered the phone when I rang this afternoon?" There, it was out. She had really fallen for Greg and was not at all sure she really wanted to know the answer to her question. "Eh? What are you talking about?" said Greg, taken aback. He's obviously a good liar, thought Emma to herself. "I phoned you this afternoon, and a woman answered and said you were in the shower." Emma's voice was now full of derision, certain that he had been two-timing her. "Emma, there's no woman here. You must have called the wrong number, babe." "Don't babe me. I hate that word. Goodbye." With that, she hung up. Greg called back immediately. "Emma, I swear on my father's grave, no woman was here today." That made Emma stop and think. In the short time she had known Greg, she had gathered that he had worshipped his late father. He was always talking about him and celebrating all the things he had done in his life. And yet she knew that she had not dialed the wrong number, as she had Greg's phone number stored in her mobile, and she was sure that she had not pressed some other stored number. Or had she? She was now beginning to doubt herself. She suddenly found herself saying, "Okay, I'm sorry for doubting you," and she then timidly whispered that she loved him. He did not reciprocate by saying that he loved her too. He avoided saying things like that nowadays, but she could tell he was very upset because she had half accused him of being unfaithful. On the following day, Greg took Emma to an out-of-town shopping center, and as they made their way back to his flat in a taxi, Emma suggested they should stop off at a pub and have a relaxing drink. Greg agreed it was a great idea and asked the cab driver if he could take them to the nearest pub, and he soon pulled up outside the Bulldog on Layfield Road. In a corner of this pub, Greg poured out his heart and explained why he had never told Emma that he loved her, even though he truly did, and that he was scared to jump in at the deep end after the big breakup with her, meaning Ashley. "But I tell you what, Emma, I wish I'd met you instead of her all those years back. We'd probably have a few kids and a semi in Naughty Ash by now," Greg told her, looking down at the rising, slow-motion bubbles in his pint of lager. Emma hugged him and had to struggle to hold back the tears. Then she beamed a beautiful smile. "Why, Naughty Ash," she laughed. "What's so special about it?" "I don't know. I just always thought it would be great to have an address with Naughty Ash in it. It sounds so funny." An hour later they were making love in Greg's bed, which was where something very worrying took place. The bed started shaking, and no, it was not the two lovers that were causing the effect. "Greg, what's happening?" shrieked Emma, clinging to him as the bed turned clockwise by about 40 degrees, then juddered to a halt. Greg swore, and he and Emma sat up, looking at the bed and then at one another with shocked expressions. He made a feeble joke about feeling the earth move, but Emma was not amused. She had found the whole thing deeply disturbing, and she leapt out of bed and started to dress. "What are you doing, Em? You're not going, are you?" "Yes, I'm going home," Emma told him, then jumped to one side. "Ouch!" she cried. "Something's just pinched my leg. Look at it." Greg could see the red mark just above her knee. "Well, I didn't do it, if that's what you're thinking," he said. "I know you didn't. There's a ghost in here," said Emma, buttoning her blouse up wrongly in her rush to get her clothes on. Greg repositioned the bed and then got dressed himself. He pulled on a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and his moccasin slippers, and as he hunted for his car keys, he felt cold fingers stroke his face. By then, Emma was already in the hallway. She had turned very pale, and even though her fingers were feeling her left earlobe for a lost earring, she did not stop to look for it, because the ghost had really freaked her out. "Hang on a minute, I don't know where my car keys are," said Greg, looking down the side and back of his bedside cabinet where he had left them. "I'll be outside," said Emma, and left the hallway without waiting for a reply. After several minutes of frantic searching, Greg finally located his keys. They were in his kitchen cupboard for some bizarre reason, even though he knew for a fact that he had not put them there. He tried to open the front door, but it seemed to be stuck and would not budge. He twisted the handle this way and that, but the door felt as if it were locked. He lifted the flap of the letterbox and could see Emma standing in a blustery wind next to his car. "I can't open the door," he shouted to her. She came over and stooped down so that her eyes met his through the letterbox. "You're kidding," she said, straightening up. She could see Greg through the frosted glass of the front door, and she could also see the fuzzy outline of someone approaching behind him from the end of the hallway. "Who the heck's that?" she shouted through the letterbox. "Who's what? What are you talking about, Emma?" Greg shouted back, his voice muffled somewhat as the flap of the letterbox dropped down. The handle of the front door twisted violently of its own accord, and the door shook as Greg shouted Emma's name. To Emma's horror, she could see a woman grappling with him through the frosted glass. A woman with a livid, snow-white face, contrasting sharply with her mop of curly red hair. Emma grabbed hold of the door handle and screamed out at the top of her voice. She rammed the door with every ounce of her strength, and it eventually shot open to reveal Greg standing a few feet down the hall with his arms outstretched as if he were fighting off someone or something. "Get off! Get off!" he screamed. "Emma, help me! Do something, please!" Emma grabbed hold of him and pulled him towards the front door. Just as they were crossing the threshold, something snatched at a lock of her long hair and tugged it with such force that her scalp felt as if it were being torn. Emma let out a string of expletives and lashed out at whatever was behind her with her left fist, while still clinging on to Greg with her other hand. Her valiant efforts paid off when the thing finally released her hair. Without a backward glance, the couple fled from the house, jumped into the car, and tore off down the road, knowing that they had left the front door wide open. At the end of the road, Greg suddenly regained a modicum of courage and decided to reverse the vehicle so that he could go and lock up, despite Emma pleading with him to take her home and not go back. Greg argued that he could not just leave the door unlocked. He might have all his stuff stolen, and he was not prepared to take the risk. He got out of the car and cautiously approached the entrance to the flat, then took a deep breath before attempting to close the door. As he put his hand on the door knocker, something invisible was heard to run down the hallway, screeching with laughter as it flew towards him. It wrapped itself around him and held him in a vice-like embrace, even though he staggered backwards into the street. He pounded his own chest as he tried to beat it off, but it would not free him from its clutches. Then he felt those icy lips on his face again. Those same lips he had felt that night when he had awakened in the darkness. The lips traced the contours of his face and slid over to his ear. "I'm buried in you, tree," giggled the entity's voice. "Does that put you off, love?" "Greg, what's wrong?" Emma shouted over to him as she left the car. She could see him standing on the path with a look of petrified horror on his face. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son," Greg recited as he made the sign of the cross, "and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." At these words, the entity's inhuman strength seemed to evaporate, and it slithered to the ground. A heartbeat later, the front door slammed shut, all by itself. Emma took hold of Greg's hand and guided him gently back to the car, and as she did so, she noticed the net curtains of the lounge window twitch slightly, as if someone was watching them, even though she knew that the lounge was empty. She even thought she saw a pallid face come into view behind those curtains. She shuddered, relieved to be out of the haunted flat. The couple drove off at speed, and not until they had put several miles behind themselves and Greg's flat were they able to breathe more easily. Nothing would have persuaded Greg to return to that flat in West Derby, even to collect his things. His friend Clark and another man kindly offered to go and collect them for him, and both said that something had spat at them as they walked down the hallway carrying his television set to their van. Clark also noted that his radio had been smashed to bits and a number of plates had been shattered on the kitchen floor. Greg was so badly shaken up by his ordeal that he had to stay off work for a month and suffered terrible nightmares about the ghost. He also had an asthma attack one night after waking up from one particularly bad dream. A neighbor of the haunted flat says the ghost is that of a middle-aged woman who died after a long and painful illness in the 1980s. She was buried at Yew Tree Cemetery, which is not too far from the haunted residence. This neighbor told me how one night when he was reading the echo in his living room, he suddenly became aware of a faint noise close behind him. His immediate thought was that it was an intruder, so he braced himself, ready to face him. As he did so, he also became aware of a sweet smell. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw that it was a ghostly woman. "I'm sure it was the ghost from the empty flat next door," he said. "Probably came through the wall for a bit of company. I turned to face her, and she vanished. To be honest, I was relieved it was just her, and not the burglar I'd been expecting." The neighbor also told me how, on the day that Greg and Emma left the flat for good, the ghost could be heard sobbing through the walls all night, and at 2 in the morning took to throwing objects about. This behavior would certainly account for the smashed plates on the kitchen floor and the broken radio, which Clark had described.